Hello, fellow time traveler. Picture this. The golden sun rises over the Nile, painting the pyramids in amber light, a perfect postcard of ancient Egyptian glory. But wait, look closer. That's not incense creating that haze in the air. It's the smoke of funeral pyres. I'm glad you've joined me tonight for what might be the least relaxing bedtime story ever told. Wherever you are, perhaps wrapped in your clean, modern blankets, surrounded by hand sanitizer and medicine cabinets, I invite you to journey with me to a world where the smallest insect bite could be your death sentence. If you're eating dinner while watching this, you might want to set it aside. But don't worry, I promise it'll still be there when we're done. Unlike the food supplies of many ancient Egyptians when plagues struck their communities. Tonight, we're exploring what happened when disease ravaged the land of pharaohs and pyramids, a civilization we often romanticize for its golden treasures and mystical hieroglyphs. The reality, however, was far from the gleaming artifacts in museum displays. These were people who lived, suffered, and died under conditions that would make our modern pandemic experiences look like a luxury spa retreat. The ancient Egyptians built monumental structures that have lasted millennia, but their bodies remained as fragile as ours. They created sophisticated systems of writing and mathematics. Therefore, their confusion when invisible pathogens decimated entire villages was all the more profound. They worshipped powerful gods who controlled every aspect of their lives. But when plague struck, those gods seemed to have abandoned them. From roughly 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, the civilization along the Nile experienced repeated waves of devastating diseases, some biblical, some biological, all brutal. While we might picture Cleopatra lounging on silken cushions or Ramses commanding vast armies, we rarely imagine these same rulers covered in painful boils or watching helplessly as their children succumb to fever. I'm sharing this story not just to make you grateful for antibiotics, though you absolutely should be sending thank you cards to Alexander Fleming's descendants, but to understand how disease shaped one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Before we fully dive into this ancient world of suffering, I should acknowledge something. We're viewing these events through our 21st century microscope. Modern science gives us answers the Egyptians could never access. Where we see bacteria and viruses, they saw divine punishment or malevolent spirits. The microscopic battles we understand today were, to them, cosmic wars between gods. In the hours ahead, we'll trace how these invisible enemies influenced everything from religious practices to architectural decisions. We'll meet people from all levels of society, from pharaohs to peasants, and see how disease cared nothing for social hierarchy, even if treatment options certainly did. I mean, having your own royal physician was the ancient equivalent of having premium health insurance with no deductible, except that both doctors might have equally suggested more leeches as a treatment plan. We'll explore the biblical plagues and their possible scientific explanations, examine mummies that still bear the scars of smallpox, and discover how malaria shaped settlement patterns along the Nile. We'll uncover archaeological evidence of mass graves and learn how Egyptian medical papyri documented symptoms we can now diagnose millennia later. So settle in, perhaps with a sip of clean, parasite-free water, a luxury your average Egyptian couldn't count on, as we begin our journey through one of history's most fascinating yet terrifying intersections of human civilization and microscopic invaders. By the time our story ends, you'll understand that while the pyramids may stand as testaments to Egyptian greatness, it was their struggle against invisible enemies that truly revealed their resilience, a resilience we share as we face our own modern plagues with the same fundamentally human hope and fear. The sun rises over the Nile Valley, bathing mud brick homes in golden light. A woman fills her clay pot with river water. Children chase hoopoe birds between papyrus reeds. Men haul limestone blocks using nothing but rope, sweat, and mathematical precision. This is ancient Egypt, a civilization that feels both familiar and utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. To understand how devastating plagues were to the Egyptian people, we must first understand what their world looked like before disease struck. Imagine living your entire life within walking distance of the same river, the mighty Nile. stretching like a blue-green serpent through an otherwise inhospitable desert. The river wasn't just a water source, it was life itself. The Egyptians didn't even need a word for rain in many regions. Why would they? The Nile's annual flood delivered everything they needed. Life flowed with the rhythm of this flooding, a natural clock that dictated planting, harvesting, and tax collection. When the waters rose in summer, they brought not just moisture, but fertile black silt from the Ethiopian highlands. When the floods receded, they left behind a rejuvenated landscape. Therefore, farmers rushed to plant wheat, barley, and flax in the rich soil. The growing season followed, then harvest time, before the whole cycle began again with the next inundation. Think of it as nature's subscription box service, except missing a delivery meant starvation, rather than just a disappointed email to customer service. This predictable cycle created one of history's most stable and long-lasting civilizations. For nearly 3,000 years, while other empires rose and fell like sandcastles at high tide, Egypt endured. Their extraordinary longevity wasn't due to isolation. The Egyptians traded with Nubians to the south, Mesopotamians to the east, and Mediterranean peoples to the north. This extensive trade network brought wealth and cultural exchange, but also created highways for disease to travel. Egyptian society was rigidly hierarchical, shaped like their iconic pyramids, broad at the base, narrow at the top. At the apex sat the pharaoh, living god-king, owner of all land, mediator between humans and deities. Below him stood the elite, priests who maintained divine favor, scribes who controlled knowledge, and nobles who administered the kingdom. The middle ranks included artisans, merchants, and skilled workers who crafted everything from papyrus scrolls to golden death masks. The pyramid's broad base consisted of farmers, servants, and laborers whose backbreaking work sustained everyone else. I know what you're thinking. Not much different from your office organizational chart, except your boss probably doesn't claim to be the living embodiment of the sun god. Although come to think of it, the way some managers strut around in their corner offices, each social class lived vastly different lives. The elite resided in spacious homes with gardens and pools, enjoying fine linen clothing, cosmetics, and exotic foods. The masses crowded into simple mud brick dwellings with dirt floors and reed mats for beds. Think of it as the difference between a 5-star resort and camping, except this camping trip lasted your entire life and included the bonus feature of parasitic infections. The Egyptians were remarkably advanced in many ways. They performed complex surgeries, built architectural wonders that still baffle engineers, and developed sophisticated writing and record-keeping systems. Their medical knowledge, preserved in papyri like the Edwin Smith and Ebers documents, reveals treatments ranging from practical wound care to incantations against demonic influences. They understood anatomy from mummification practices, recognized certain disease patterns, and developed an extensive pharmacopoeia of herbs and minerals. Yet despite these advancements, they remained vulnerable to disease. Their understanding of illness blended the physical and supernatural. Health represented harmony with the cosmic order, Ma'at, while sickness indicated divine displeasure or malevolent magic. When your doctor believes your tuberculosis might be caused by an angry deity or a neighbor's curse, you're not exactly getting evidence-based medicine. It's more like receiving a WebMD diagnosis from someone who also consults star charts and chicken entrails. Daily life brought Egyptians into constant contact with disease vectors. Farmers waded through irrigation canals alongside human waste and waterborne parasites. Families lived in close quarters with domesticated animals. Cats, dogs, pigs, and cattle shared their living spaces, bringing fleas, ticks, and zoonotic infections. Food storage attracted rodents. Communal granaries became breeding grounds for fungi and insects. It was basically a microscopic battle royale with humans as the unwitting arena. Urban centers like Memphis and Thebes concentrated thousands of people without modern sanitation. Public bathhouses existed, but clean water wasn't guaranteed. Personal hygiene was valued. Egyptians used natron, a natural mineral salt, as soap and deodorant. Therefore, they were cleaner than many ancient peoples. But without understanding germ theory, even the most fastidious Egyptian couldn't escape invisible pathogens. Religious practices sometimes exacerbated disease spread. Temple ceremonies brought crowds together in enclosed spaces. Ritual washing pools became microbe exchange centers. Pilgrims traveling to sacred sites carried infections between communities. The embalmers who prepared bodies for mummification handled infected corpses without protective equipment. Imagine doing an autopsy wearing nothing but a linen kilt and an amulet for protection. Not exactly following OSHA guidelines, is it? Climate played its role too. The hot, dry environment preserved some pathogens while killing others. Seasonal winds carried fungal spores across vast distances. The very flood waters that nourished crops also created ideal breeding conditions for mosquitoes and waterborne parasites. Nature giveth, and nature taketh away, usually via tiny creatures you can't even see. When disease struck this ordered world, the effects cascaded through every aspect of society. Agricultural production faltered as farmers fell ill. Construction projects stalled as laborers died. Religious ceremonies were disrupted. Trade slowed or stopped entirely. The administrative machinery that collected taxes, resolved disputes, and maintained irrigation systems broke down. For a civilization that valued order above all else, epidemics represented not just physical but existential threats. Consider this. When you catch a cold, you might miss a few days of work or reschedule a dinner date. When infectious disease swept through ancient Egypt, entire communities could disappear. Villages were abandoned. Dynasties collapsed. The cosmic order itself seemed to unravel. Into this precarious balance of survival and flourishing, plagues introduced chaos. These weren't just medical emergencies, but spiritual crises that demanded explanations. Why would the gods who blessed Egypt with the life-giving Nile also curse it with devastating disease? This fundamental question would shape Egyptian religious thought, medical practice, and social responses to epidemics for millennia. As we move deeper into the brutal reality of ancient Egyptian plagues, remember that behind every statistic was a person not so different from you or me, someone who loved, feared, hoped, and suffered. Their world may have been alien in many ways, but their humanity was identical to our own. And in that shared humanity lies the true lesson of history. We have always been fragile creatures in a dangerous world, sustained only by our remarkable ability to adapt, endure, and find meaning even in our darkest hours. A physician priest kneels beside his patient, papyrus scroll unfurled. His fingers trace hieroglyphs detailing symptoms. The sick man writhes, skin burning with fever. The healer reaches for his medical kit, a small wooden chest containing dried herbs, mineral compounds, and amulets. He's caught between two worlds, empirical observation and spiritual belief. This duality defined Egyptian medicine. Egyptian medical practitioners weren't simply doctors. They were intermediaries between the physical and divine realms. Many served as priests of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess associated with both healing and plagues. Think of them as combination doctor, pharmacist, therapist, exorcist priests, which makes your modern-day GP with their 7-minute appointments seem rather underwhelming by comparison. Their approach to medicine existed at a fascinating crossroads. Empirical observations led to effective treatments, but religious frameworks explained causation. They could set broken bones with remarkable skill. Therefore, patients trusted their expertise. Their anatomical knowledge surpassed most ancient civilizations. However, they attributed disease to supernatural forces. This created a medical system that was simultaneously sophisticated and superstitious. The Egyptians' understanding of the body centered on the concept of channels, or mitu. These pathways carried vital substances, blood, tears, urine, semen, throughout the body. Disease occurred when these channels became blocked or contaminated. It's not entirely unlike how we view circulatory or lymphatic systems today, except their anatomical map included channels for transporting magic and divine influences. It's as if your biology textbook included chapters on chakras and aura cleansing alongside cardiovascular function. Two medical papyri give us remarkable insight into their medical knowledge. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains 48 case studies of injuries with surprisingly rational treatments. Each case follows a logical format: examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. For treatable conditions, it prescribes practical interventions, stitching wounds, setting fractures, reducing dislocations. For hopeless cases, it honestly states, an ailment not to be treated. Imagine that level of medical frankness today. Sorry about your condition, Dave. Nothing to be done. Next patient, please. The Ebers Papyrus, by contrast, represents a more magical approach. Its 877 remedies include rational herbal medicines alongside spells and incantations. For heart disease, it recommends wearing amulets. For infected wounds, it prescribes moldy bread, unknowingly harnessing antibiotic properties thousands of years before penicillin. For demon-caused illnesses, it offers exorcism chants. It's like finding a CVS pharmacy where half the shelves contain modern medications and the other half crystal healing sets and exorcism kits. Egyptian pharmacology was remarkably advanced. Their physicians utilized over 700 substances in their remedies: herbs, minerals, and animal products. Many contained genuinely effective compounds. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, reduced pain and inflammation. Garlic and onions provided antibacterial properties. Honey dressed wounds with natural antimicrobial effects. They even developed specialized treatments for specific diseases, showing they recognized distinct patterns of symptoms. Their diagnostic skills were similarly impressive. Egyptian physicians could identify tuberculosis, arthritis, kidney stones, and various parasitic infections through careful observation. They measured pulse rates, examined bodily fluids, and noted skin color changes. They recognized contagion in some diseases, warning that certain eye infections could spread through physical contact. Surgery also featured in their medical repertoire. Evidence shows they performed amputations, tumor removals, and trepanation, drilling holes in the skull. They used sutures to close wounds and specialized tools crafted from copper and bronze. Surgical patients received pain management through opium, mandrake, and alcohol. I think we can all agree that if you're having a hole drilled in your skull in 1500 BCE, you'd definitely appreciate that complimentary beer beforehand, possibly several. Yet for all these practical skills, Egyptian medicine remained deeply intertwined with religious beliefs. Disease represented cosmic imbalance, a disruption of Ma'at, order, by Isfet, chaos. When the natural order was disturbed, sickness followed. This disturbance could stem from multiple causes: angry gods, malevolent ghosts, or hostile magic. Diagnosis often involved determining which supernatural force caused the illness. Was it Sekhmet's punishment, a deceased relative's vengeance, a curse from an enemy? The treatment would address both physical symptoms and spiritual causes. A patient might receive herbal medicine for fever while also wearing protective amulets and reciting prayers to appease offended deities. It's rather like treating your flu with both NyQuil and a strongly worded letter of apology to whatever cosmic force you've inadvertently annoyed. This dual approach meant Egyptian physicians were part scientists, part theologians. They observed cause and effect in the physical world, but explained those observations through supernatural frameworks. They collected empirical data. Therefore, they developed effective treatments. They performed successful surgeries. However, they attributed healing to divine intervention. When confronted with epidemic disease, this duality became both strength and weakness. Their practical observations helped identify patterns and implement some effective measures, like isolating the sick or improving hygiene. Their spiritual framework provided psychological comfort and social cohesion during frightening outbreaks. But their supernatural explanations also limited their ability to understand the true mechanisms of disease transmission and implement effective public health measures. Consider Imhotep, perhaps history's first named physician. Born a commoner around 26 and 50 BCE, he rose to become vizier to Pharaoh Djoser, and high priest of Ra at Heliopolis. His medical knowledge was so renowned that after his death, he was deified as a healing god. Temples dedicated to Imhotep became centers of medical treatment where the sick would sleep, hoping to receive healing dreams from the physician god. One tale describes Imhotep facing a mysterious plague during Djoser's reign. After conventional treatments failed, he supposedly received divine inspiration. He ordered large fires built throughout affected areas, and bitter herbs burned to purify the air. Remarkably, this may have actually helped, the smoke potentially driving away disease-carrying insects, and the herbs possibly containing compounds toxic to certain pathogens. It was accidental public health through religious practice, effective even without understanding the actual mechanism. This pattern repeated throughout Egyptian medical history. When plague struck, physician priests would observe its spread, attempt to treat symptoms, and implement measures that sometimes helped contain outbreaks. But because they attributed disease to divine displeasure or magical influences, their preventative measures often focused on appeasing gods rather than addressing environmental factors. Their explanatory models made perfect sense within their worldview. If gods controlled the Nile's life-giving flood, why wouldn't they also control the invisible forces of disease? If magic could influence human affairs, why couldn't it affect human bodies? Without microscopes to reveal bacteria or knowledge of viral transmission, supernatural explanations filled the gaps in understanding. The invisible world of microbes was explained through the invisible world of spirits. As we continue our journey through ancient Egyptian plagues, remember that the people experiencing these disasters didn't lack intelligence, they lacked context. They were using the best explanatory tools available to them, just as we do today. Our modern understanding of disease rests upon thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and technological advancement. Future generations may look back at our medical practices with the same bemused compassion with which we view the Egyptian physician clutching his papyrus and amulets, both of us simply trying to make sense of suffering with the tools at hand. The pharaoh's courtyard falls silent. A grey-bearded stranger stands before the throne, staff gripped tight. "Let my people go," he demands. The pharaoh scoffs. The visitor throws down his staff. It writhes, transforms, becomes a serpent. Court magicians replicate the trick. The stranger smiles thinly. "You've seen nothing yet," his eyes seem to say. The most famous plague narrative in history is about to unfold. The biblical account of the 10 plagues of Egypt represents perhaps the most well-known epidemic disaster story ever told. Even if you've never opened a Bible, you've likely encountered these plagues through cultural osmosis, Hollywood films, or possibly that time your religious aunt cornered you at Thanksgiving dinner. The story has embedded itself into our collective consciousness. According to the Book of Exodus, when an unnamed pharaoh refused to release the enslaved Israelites, God unleashed 10 increasingly devastating plagues upon Egypt. Water turned to blood, frogs overran the land, lice and flies swarmed everywhere, livestock perished from disease, boils erupted on human skin, hail destroyed crops, locusts devoured what remained, darkness blanketed the country, and finally, the firstborn sons of Egypt, from peasant to pharaoh, died in a single night. It's a compelling narrative of divine retribution, but historical evidence for these exact events remains elusive. Egyptians weren't exactly eager to document their catastrophic defeats. Therefore, their records contain no clear reference to these specific plagues. The lack of Egyptian confirmation has led many scholars to question the historical accuracy of the account. However, intriguing scientific theories suggest natural phenomena might explain several of these plagues. Let's examine these potential natural explanations, not to diminish the religious significance for believers, but to understand how ancient people might have experienced and interpreted real environmental disasters. After all, the line between miracle and terrifying natural phenomenon we don't understand yet has always been rather blurry. Just ask anyone who witnessed a solar eclipse before astronomy was invented, or anyone who's tried to explain to their grandparents how cloud storage works. The first plague, water turning to blood, might describe an algal bloom called a red tide. These microscopic organisms multiply rapidly in warm water, staining it blood red and releasing toxins that kill fish. The Nile occasionally experiences these blooms, particularly when floodwaters stagnate. Alternatively, the red color might have come from iron-rich soil washed down from Ethiopian highlands during unusually heavy floods. Either way, imagine waking up to find your only water source looking like a horror movie prop. That's enough to convince anyone that supernatural forces are at work. This contaminated water could have triggered the second plague, frogs. As their aquatic habitat became toxic, frogs would flee en masse onto land, into streets, homes, and even beds. Think of it as a desperate frog evacuation, except instead of orderly lines and emergency shelters, you get amphibians in your soup and croaking from inside your pillowcase. Eventually, without clean water to return to, the frogs would die, creating piles of decomposing amphibian corpses throughout Egyptian settlements. These rotting frog carcasses create perfect breeding conditions for the third and fourth plagues, lice and flies. Insects would feast on the decaying matter and multiply exponentially. If you think summer mosquitoes at your backyard barbecue are annoying, imagine swarms of biting insects so dense they darken the sky. Less bug spray might be nice, and more, perhaps we should have appeased whatever god is clearly furious with us. The insect swarms would then spread disease to animals, explaining the fifth plague of livestock death. Biting flies can transmit anthrax and other bacterial infections between animals. The biblical timing makes agricultural sense too. The plagues allegedly began in early spring, when Egyptian cattle would be in pastures near the Nile, making them vulnerable to insect-borne pathogens. The sixth plague, boils on humans, likely represents the same diseases jumping from animals to people. Anthrax causes characteristic skin lesions and can spread from livestock to humans. Other possibilities include glanders or malignant pustule. Whatever the specific pathogen, the progression from environmental disaster to insect outbreak to animal disease to human illness follows a logical epidemiological chain. It's like watching the world's most horrifying domino effect, where the final domino is you, covered in painful, oozing sores. The seventh and eighth plagues, hail followed by locusts, describe agricultural disasters that could devastate already weakened food supplies. Severe storms do occasionally strike Egypt, particularly in the Delta region. As for locusts, these remain an agricultural nightmare across North Africa and the Middle East to this day. A desert locust swarm can contain up to 80 million insects per square kilometer, each consuming its own weight in vegetation daily. They can transform a green field into bare earth within hours. It's nature's version of those competitive eating contests, except instead of hot dogs, it's your entire food supply for the year. The ninth plague of darkness might represent a severe sandstorm or Khamsin wind. These dust storms can blot out the sun for days, creating an eerie darkness. Alternatively, some researchers suggest the darkness might have been caused by the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1500 BCE, which spewed ash across the eastern Mediterranean. Either way, after experiencing 8 previous disasters, 3 days of unnatural darkness would have seemed like the universe itself was shutting down operations. The 10th and most terrible plague, death of the firstborn, defies simple natural explanation, but might relate to food contamination. Some scholars suggest that grain stored in damp conditions after the earlier disasters could have developed fungal poisoning from ergot. This fungus produces powerful toxins that cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. If firstborn sons received ceremonial first portions of contaminated grain, they might have received lethal doses. Others propose that in food-scarce conditions, families might have prioritized feeding younger children, leaving older ones more vulnerable to starvation or disease. The timing of these plagues may coincide with actual ecological disasters during Egypt's New Kingdom period. Some researchers point to the Thera eruption around 1500 BCE as a potential trigger for climatic anomalies that could have caused several of these disasters in sequence. Others suggest the plagues might reflect folk memories of multiple catastrophes compiled into a single narrative for religious significance. Did these events happen exactly as described in Exodus? Probably not. But natural disasters similar to the biblical plagues certainly struck Egypt repeatedly throughout its long history. When the Nile behaved unusually, flooding too much or too little, ecological consequences cascaded through Egyptian society. Therefore, regular patterns of disaster and recovery formed part of their collective experience. The biblical narrative may have crystallized these recurring disasters into a single, theologically meaningful story. For the Egyptians experiencing these disasters, the explanation would have been clear: divine disfavor. Their religious system emphasized maintaining cosmic order through proper rituals and offerings. When catastrophes struck, they assumed they had failed their gods in some way. For the Israelite authors of Exodus, the explanation was different but similarly divine. Their God demonstrating superiority over Egyptian deities and punishing the pharaoh's oppression. These contrasting religious interpretations highlight how ancient peoples made meaning from suffering. Without modern scientific frameworks, they reached for theological explanations that reinforced their worldviews and provided emotional comfort amid chaos. The story also served important cultural functions. For Israelites, it established their identity as a people chosen for divine rescue. For later Jewish generations, it provided hope during subsequent oppressions. For Christians, it prefigured their own salvation narrative. Whether you view the 10 plagues as literal history, metaphorical truth, or elaborate fiction, their enduring power lies in how they capture a universal human experience, our vulnerability to forces beyond our control, and our desperate need to find meaning in suffering. When disaster strikes, we still ask the same questions ancient Egyptians did. Why is this happening? What did we do wrong? How can we make it stop? Our answers may be dressed in scientific language rather than religious terminology, but the fundamental human need to explain calamity remains unchanged across millennia. An archaeologist's brush whispers across bone. Dust clouds rise and settle. The skeleton lies curled, as if sleeping, one among hundreds in this mass grave. They died quickly, too quickly for proper burial rituals. The archaeologist notes telltale marks on the ribs. This wasn't peaceful. This was plague, a silent killer preserved in the desert sands for millennia. While written records offer glimpses into ancient Egyptian disease, archaeology provides tangible evidence of epidemic disasters. The sands that preserved magnificent temples and glittering treasures also preserved humanity's microscopic enemies and their devastating effects. Egypt's arid climate creates perfect conditions for preserving biological evidence that would deteriorate elsewhere, giving us a unique window into ancient disease. Excavations across Egypt have uncovered mass graves dating to various periods, their occupants buried hastily during crisis. Traditional Egyptian burial practices were elaborate affairs requiring weeks of preparation. But these emergency interments show bodies piled together with minimal ceremony. The dead outnumbered the living's capacity to properly honor them. Therefore, expedience replaced ritual. Disease can kill faster than graves can be dug, a brutal reality as true in ancient Thebes as it was in medieval London or 1918 Kansas. Perhaps the most revealing sight is Tel El Amarna, the short-lived capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten around 1350 BCE. Abandoned after his death, the city remained largely untouched, providing an archaeological time capsule. Recent excavations of Amarna's commoners' cemetery revealed a grim picture of life and death during this supposedly golden age. Over 90% of the skeletons show signs of malnutrition, anemia, and stunted growth. Many bear evidence of repeated infections, their bones telling stories their lips never could. The South Tomb Cemetery at Amarna contained remains of approximately 400 individuals, many showing signs of multiple health problems. One particularly telling grave contained a middle-aged woman and 3 children, all buried together with signs suggesting they died simultaneously. classic evidence of an infectious disease outbreak. I suppose you could call it a family plan, but definitely not the kind you'd sign up for voluntarily. Modern scientific techniques have revolutionized what we can learn from these ancient remains. Paleopathology, the study of ancient disease, combines traditional archaeology with cutting-edge biomedical analysis. DNA extraction from teeth and bones can identify specific pathogens. Stable isotope analysis reveals dietary patterns and potential malnutrition. CT scans show internal lesions invisible to the naked eye. It's CSI, ancient Egypt, but with fewer sunglasses wearing one-liner specialists and more genuinely excited academics who haven't seen sunlight in months. One of the most famous paleopathological studies involved the mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died around 1145 BCE. His well-preserved remains show characteristic pockmarks suggesting he died of smallpox. This discovery provided crucial evidence for tracking smallpox's evolutionary history, suggesting it has plagued humanity for at least 3,000 years. Imagine having your cause of death discussed by scientists 3 millennia later. Talk about posthumous fame without any of the perks. Royal mummies offer excellent research specimens due to their careful preservation, but they represent an elite minority. For understanding widespread epidemics, the hurriedly buried remains of common Egyptians provide more valuable data. A 2018 excavation near a Theban quarry uncovered a mass grave containing over 60 individuals with evidence of an acute infectious disease that killed within days. Bone samples contain traces of bacterial DNA related to typhoid fever, suggesting an outbreak around 1500 BCE. Teeth tell particularly compelling stories about disease. Dental pulp preserves microbial DNA better than most body tissues. Researchers have extracted ancient pathogen DNA from Egyptian teeth, identifying evidence of tuberculosis, leprosy, and various parasitic infections. One study of teeth from a Middle Kingdom cemetery near Thebes found evidence of malaria parasites in nearly 30% of samples, confirmation that the disease was endemic along the Nile thousands of years ago. Beyond human remains, archaeological evidence for disease appears in surviving medical tools and texts. Surgical instruments found in tombs include specialized tools for draining abscesses and treating infected wounds. Temple walls sometimes depict healing scenes, showing patients with visible disease symptoms. Administrative papyri occasionally mention years of plague, when tax collection was reduced or labor projects delayed. These passing references hint at epidemics significant enough to disrupt the machinery of state. The ancient city of Avaris in the Nile Delta provides another archaeological window into epidemic disease. Excavations revealed evidence of rapid population decline around 1715 BCE, with abandoned homes and interrupted construction projects suggesting a sudden crisis. Human remains from this period show high percentages of stress markers and premature death. Analysis of preserved insects from trash middens identified several disease-carrying species, including fleas capable of transmitting bubonic plague. Egyptian art occasionally depicts individuals with visible disease. A famous wall painting from Thebes shows a temple doorkeeper with a withered leg and foot deformity characteristic of polio. Statues sometimes depict nobles with the distended abdomen suggesting schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease still common in Egypt today. These representations were likely meant to be realistic rather than symbolic, capturing the subjects as they actually appeared, complete with their medical conditions. It seems even ancient Egyptian Instagram couldn't completely escape reality. Perhaps the most compelling archaeological evidence comes from a site near Luxor, excavated in 2020. Archaeologists discovered what appears to be a specialized quarantine facility dating to the New Kingdom period. The compound includes isolation rooms, evidence of medical treatments, and a dedicated burial area. Clay tablets found within the complex contain lists of patients, their symptoms, and treatments. Many entries end with the Egyptian hieroglyph for death, followed by burial details. It's essentially a 3,500-year-old hospital record. though their patient satisfaction surveys were considerably more straightforward than the 8-page forms you're asked to fill out today. Paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climate, adds another dimension to understanding Egyptian epidemics. Tree ring data, lake sediment cores, and ice samples provide information about climate fluctuations that may have triggered disease outbreaks. A prolonged drought around 2200 BCE coincides with the collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom and evidence of widespread malnutrition. Conversely, unusually wet periods correlate with spikes in waterborne illness markers in human remains. Climate and disease have always danced together, their partnership written in both human bones and environmental records. Technological innovations continue to reveal new insights about ancient Egyptian disease. Advanced imaging techniques can detect pathological changes invisible to earlier researchers. Proteomics, the study of ancient proteins, complements DNA analysis in identifying specific diseases. Three-dimensional computer modeling reconstructs disease progression in mummified individuals. Each technological leap brings us closer to understanding what sickened and killed people thousands of years ago. The scientific value of these discoveries extends beyond historical curiosity. Ancient pathogens provide crucial data points for tracking the evolution of disease organisms. By comparing ancient and modern disease strains, researchers gain insights into how pathogens adapt and change over time, knowledge potentially valuable for predicting future epidemic threats. Egyptian mummies have contributed to research on tuberculosis, malaria, and parasitic diseases that continue to affect millions worldwide. As we piece together evidence from bones, texts, art, and artifacts, a clearer picture emerges of disease's impact on ancient Egyptian society. Epidemics weren't just occasional disasters, but constant companions, shaping everything from religious practices to architectural choices. The archaeological record reveals not just what diseases struck Egypt, but how they influenced the civilization's development across millennia, reminding us that our own society's structures and behaviors remain profoundly shaped by our ongoing relationship with microscopic threats we can barely see, even with all our technological advantages. A merchant ship docks at Alexandria. Rats scurry down mooring ropes, disappearing into shadowy warehouses. Inside their fur, tiny fleas carry an invisible passenger, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Death has just arrived in Egypt, and no one has noticed. Within weeks, people will begin falling ill with swollen lymph nodes and blackened skin. By then, it will be too late to stop what's coming. The Black Death of the 14th century devastated medieval Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. But this notorious pandemic wasn't humanity's first encounter with bubonic plague. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests ancient Egypt experienced bubonic plague outbreaks more than 3,000 years before the medieval catastrophe. These earlier epidemics shaped Egyptian society in profound ways, influencing everything from religious practices to trade relationships. Bubonic plague's distinctive calling card is the bubo, a painful swollen lymph node typically appearing in the groin, armpit, or neck. These inflamed nodes can grow as large as chicken eggs, turning a deep purple or black color. Fever follows, along with headaches, extreme weakness, and often delirium. Without treatment, death arrives within days. The disease kills roughly 60% of those infected. Therefore, survival often seemed random and miraculous. The unpredictable nature of who lived and who died reinforced Egyptian beliefs that divine will determined one's fate. The earliest evidence for bubonic plague in Egypt comes from the late Old Kingdom period, around 2200 BCE. A medical papyrus fragment from this era describes a disease with symptoms remarkably similar to plague: swollen lymph nodes, high fever, and rapid death. The text refers to the illness as the striking down and links it to the goddess Sekhmet, known for both healing and deadly epidemics. Egyptian physicians recognized the disease's contagious nature. However, they attributed its spread to supernatural rather than natural causes. For modern readers, there's something almost comical about ancient plague treatments, if gallows humor is your thing. One prescription recorded in the Ebers Papyrus recommends applying hot donkey dung to buboes, presumably on the theory that one form of suffering might distract from another. Other remedies included herbal poultices, bloodletting, and prayers to Sekhmet. It's not entirely unlike modern medicine's occasional approach of take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning, except with more dung and a significantly lower likelihood of morning ever arriving. Archaeological evidence strengthens the case for ancient Egyptian plague. Excavations at Tel el-Daba in the eastern Nile Delta uncovered mass graves dating to around 1715 BCE. DNA analysis of preserved dental pulp from several skeletons detected Yersinia pestis, genetic material, a smoking gun for bubonic plague's presence. The burials show signs of hasty, crisis-time disposal rather than traditional Egyptian funerary practices. When dozens die daily, elaborate mummification becomes an unaffordable luxury, similar to how your budget vacation plans suddenly shift from beachfront resort to cousin's pull-out couch after an unexpected car repair. Egypt's vulnerability to plague stemmed from its position as a trade crossroads. The Nile connected Mediterranean ports to African kingdoms, while overland routes linked Egypt to Asia. These commercial networks brought prosperity, but also created highways for disease transmission. Merchant ships carried rats along with their cargo. Caravans brought flea-infested travelers. Granaries near ports provided perfect breeding grounds for rodent populations. It was essentially a microbial travel agency, offering all-inclusive packages to exciting new host bodies. One particularly devastating outbreak appears to have struck during the New Kingdom period around 1250 BCE, during the reign of Ramses II. A military record carved on the Temple of Karnak describes an evil pestilence that decimated Egyptian troops during a campaign against the Hittites. The inscription notes that soldiers developed painful swellings followed by fever and death, classic plague symptoms. The epidemic apparently spread from the military to civilian populations upon the army's return home, an ancient example of how wars and epidemics often march hand in hand. The Hittite archives corroborate this outbreak, with letters mentioning a deadly disease that traveled from Egypt to Anatolia, killing the Hittite king Suppiluliuma and his heir. This correspondence represents one of history's first documented international disease notifications, though considerably less formal than today's WHO protocols. No Pandemic Response Coordinator job title existed yet, though I imagine the pharaoh's vizier suddenly finding plague management added to his job responsibilities without any additional compensation or hazard pay. How did bubonic plague spread through ancient Egyptian society? The disease travels primarily through fleas that have fed on infected rodents, especially rats. When an infected rat dies, its fleas seek new hosts, including humans. Egyptian cities provided ideal conditions for rat populations. Granaries offered abundant food, mud brick buildings provided nesting spaces, and dense human settlement ensured plenty of targets for hungry fleas. The plague bacterium's life cycle created distinctive epidemic patterns. Initial cases would appear sporadically as humans encountered infected fleas. As more rats became infected and died, more fleas would seek human hosts, accelerating transmission. The epidemic would peak during warm months when flea activity increased, then decline as temperatures dropped or susceptible hosts diminished. This seasonal pattern led Egyptians to associate plague with particular times of year, often connecting outbreaks to the Nile's annual flood cycle. Temple records from Heliopolis describe offering specific anti-plague prayers during the inundation season, suggesting Egyptian priests recognized this temporal correlation. One inscription mentions priests of Sekhmet performing protective rituals when the waters rise and the striking down begins, evidence they understood the seasonal connection even without knowing the actual mechanism. Some Egyptian plague responses inadvertently helped control outbreaks. Religious purification rituals emphasized cleanliness, potentially reducing flea populations. The practice of isolating the sick limited human-to-human transmission of pneumonic plague, the rarer but more contagious form of the disease that affects the lungs. Cats, sacred in Egyptian culture, helped control rat populations. Even certain fumigation practices using aromatic resins may have repelled fleas. It's one of history's rare instances where superstition accidentally stumbled into effective public health measures, like washing your hands to ward off evil spirits and coincidentally killing germs in the process. The social impact of bubonic plague extended far beyond the immediate death toll. Outbreaks disrupted agricultural production, leading to food shortages. Trade networks collapsed as neighboring regions imposed quarantines against Egyptian goods. Construction projects stalled as laborers died or fled infected areas. Religious practices intensified, with increased offerings to gods associated with healing and protection. Surviving texts suggest some plague epidemics even contributed to political instability and dynastic transitions. One particularly poignant example comes from a noble's tomb biography at Saqqara, dating to around 2000 BCE. The official, named Anktifi, describes leading famine relief efforts after a great pestilence devastated his province. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to such a degree that everyone had come to eating their children. While this may be hyperbole, it vividly illustrates how plague could trigger cascading disasters. Disease led to labor shortages, which led to reduced harvests, which led to starvation. It's the ancient equivalent of our modern supply chain issues, except instead of waiting longer for your Amazon package, you're contemplating which family member looks most nutritious. Plague outbreaks may have influenced Egyptian architectural and urban planning decisions. After several epidemics, some settlements show evidence of wider streets, less crowded housing arrangements, and improved drainage systems. Whether these changes represented conscious disease prevention efforts or simply reflected population decline remains debatable. Either way, the physical landscape of Egypt bears the imprint of past epidemics, just as our post-COVID cities may show lasting changes in design and function. Despite its devastating impact, bubonic plague never completely disappeared from Egypt. The disease established ecological reservoirs in rodent populations, periodically re-emerging when conditions favored transmission. This pattern of dormancy and reactivation continued through the Greek and Roman periods into the medieval era, when Egypt served as one of the gateways for the Black Death's entrance into the Mediterranean world. For the individuals who experienced these ancient outbreaks, plague represented more than just a biological threat. It challenged fundamental Egyptian beliefs about cosmic order and divine protection. When prayers went unanswered and traditional remedies failed, people confronted existential questions about their relationship with the gods. Yet somehow, through countless epidemics spanning millennia, Egyptian civilization endured, a testament to human resilience in the face of invisible enemies that remain our companions even today, waiting in the shadows for their next opportunity to emerge. The mummy's face tells a silent story. Pitted scars mark the once royal skin. Even in death, even after 3,000 years, the signature of smallpox remains. This is Ramses V, Pharaoh of Egypt, whose reign was cut short around 1145 BCE. His mummified remains bear witness to humanity's ancient enemy, a virus that shaped civilizations, toppled dynasties, and left its marks on countless faces throughout history. Smallpox stands as one of history's deadliest diseases, killing an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone before its eradication in 1980. But this modern devastation was merely the final chapter in a much longer story. Evidence suggests smallpox plagued ancient Egypt for thousands of years. Therefore, Egyptian medical texts contain some of our earliest descriptions of the disease. Pharaohs commanded vast powers. However, they remained vulnerable to this microscopic foe that recognized no royal immunity. The virus, scientifically named variola, caused distinctive symptoms, that made smallpox easily identifiable even in ancient times. After an incubation period of about 12 days, victims experienced high fever, severe headache, and backache. A few days later came the telltale rash, first flat red spots, then fluid-filled blisters erupting across the body. These pustules eventually crusted over and fell away, leaving permanent scars on survivors. In severe cases, the pustules merged together or hemorrhaged, leading to almost certain death. Egyptian medical texts describe a disease called SPDT, possibly pronounced Shepdet, that almost certainly refers to smallpox. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains recommendations for treating this illness with poultices of barley and herbs applied to skin lesions. Other treatments included fumigations with specific incenses believed to drive away the disease-causing spirits. While these remedies couldn't actually combat the virus, some might have provided symptomatic relief, the ancient equivalent of, "This won't cure your illness, but it might make you marginally less miserable while your body figures things out." Archaeological evidence provides the most compelling proof of smallpox in ancient Egypt. The previously mentioned mummy of Ramses V shows characteristic pockmarks on his face and body. CT scans of his remains reveal lesions consistent with the disease. DNA analysis has even detected fragments of ancient smallpox genetic material in his tissues. It seems this pharaoh fell victim to the disease at around age 35, dying before he could even complete his elaborate tomb. Even absolute power and divine status couldn't protect against a virus, with no respect for royal protocols, a microscopic revolutionary with no interest in the established hierarchy. Other mummies show similar evidence of smallpox scarring. A 12-year-old boy from the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE, bears extensive facial pockmarks. A priestess from Thebes, dating to about 1570 BCE, shows scarring on her face and chest. These preserved victims represent just a tiny fraction of ancient Egypt's smallpox toll. For every mummified noble or priest, thousands of ordinary Egyptians contracted the disease, their remains long since returned to the desert sands. The impact of smallpox extended far beyond individual suffering. During epidemics, Egyptian society experienced profound disruptions. Temple records from the reign of Ramses III describe a smallpox outbreak that temporarily halted construction of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The inscription notes that the craftsmen were struck down by the burning disease, their skin spotted like the leopard. Work resumed only after the epidemic subsided and new artisans were trained to replace the dead. I imagine the project manager trying to explain the delay to an impatient pharaoh. "Yes, Divine One, I understand your eternal resting place is behind schedule, but have you tried recruiting stonemasons during a plague? The help-wanted hieroglyphs aren't exactly drawing crowds." Smallpox affected Egyptian culture in subtler ways too. In a society that placed tremendous value on physical appearance and ritual purity, the disfiguring scars of smallpox carried significant social stigma. Cosmetics, already popular for aesthetic and religious reasons, became essential tools for concealing pockmarks. Archaeological evidence shows specialized makeup applicators and healing balms among common grave goods, suggesting their importance in daily life. Beauty standards may have evolved to accommodate the reality that many people bore smallpox scars. It's like how Instagram filters work today, except instead of digital enhancements, Egyptians used ground malachite and coal to create the illusion of unblemished skin. Religious interpretations of smallpox varied. Some Egyptians viewed the disease as punishment from Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of both healing and plagues. Others associated it with Seth, god of chaos and disorder. Temple inscriptions describe rituals specifically designed to protect against the spotted sickness. Amulets shaped like the protective goddess Taweret were sometimes placed on smallpox patients. These spiritual responses reflect humans' universal need to find meaning in suffering, to believe that even devastating diseases operate within some comprehensible cosmic framework rather than striking randomly and pointlessly. The disease's high mortality rate, around 30% in most outbreaks, meant smallpox could decimate royal families as easily as peasant households. When smallpox struck a pharaoh's family, it could trigger succession crises and political instability. Some historians suggest that the unusual succession pattern after Ramses III may reflect smallpox deaths among his designated heirs. The virus didn't care about divine bloodlines or carefully arranged political marriages. It simply infected whoever came into contact with it. Royal isolation during epidemics became standard practice, with court physicians monitoring anyone seeking audience with the pharaoh. Perhaps history's first VIP quarantine protocols, though I doubt they used the term social distancing in their papyrus memos. Children proved especially vulnerable to smallpox. In pre-modern populations without vaccination, nearly everyone contracted the disease in childhood if they lived in affected areas. Egyptian cemetery data shows periodic spikes in child mortality that likely correspond to smallpox epidemics. One particularly poignant discovery at Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb workers, uncovered a family crypt containing 5 children who apparently died within days of each other around 1250 BCE. Their tiny coffins bear hasty inscriptions, suggesting a family overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous losses. How did smallpox spread through ancient Egyptian society? The virus transmits primarily through respiratory droplets and direct contact with skin lesions or contaminated objects. Egypt's densely populated cities and villages created ideal conditions for transmission. The virus could move rapidly through crowded urban neighborhoods, marketplaces, temples, and palaces. Trade and warfare likely introduced new strains periodically, potentially causing more severe outbreaks when populations lacked immunity to these variants. It's basically the same mechanism that spread COVID-19, minus the international air travel and conspiracy theories on social media. Unlike some epidemic diseases that arrive suddenly and then disappear, smallpox became endemic in Egypt, meaning it circulated continuously in the population. Most outbreaks probably remained localized, affecting single communities before burning out. Periodically, larger epidemics would sweep through multiple regions when immunity waned, or new viral variants emerged. This pattern created a society that had to function despite the constant presence of a deadly disease. Not unlike our current awkward dance with COVID variants, though without the luxury of vaccines or effective treatments. Smallpox's evolutionary history reveals its ancient Egyptian connection. Genetic studies of the virus suggest it diverged from an ancestral strain about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the New Kingdom period in Egypt. The oldest confirmed genetic evidence comes from Lithuanian mummies dating to the 17th century CE, but the visible evidence on Egyptian mummies pushes the timeline back much further. Some researchers hypothesize that smallpox might have evolved from a rodent pox virus that jumped to humans in the Nile Valley, as agricultural settlements created close contact between humans and wildlife. Smallpox would continue to plague humanity for thousands of years after the fall of ancient Egypt, finally yielding to modern medicine in the 20th century. The last naturally occurring case was recorded in Somalia in 1977, marking the end of a disease that had tormented humans since the time of the pharaohs. Today, smallpox exists only in secure laboratory settings, a testament to scientific triumph over an ancient enemy that once scarred both peasants and kings, leaving its mark on faces and civilizations alike. The sun sets over the Nile. Golden light glints off still waters. In the marshes, a mosquito emerges, hungry for blood. Its delicate wings carry it toward a nearby village, where a noble family sleeps under fine linen. The insect slips through an open window, lands on exposed skin, and delivers ancient Egypt's most persistent killer, a parasite called Plasmodium, with a single bite. The cycle of suffering continues, as it has for thousands of years. While dramatic epidemics like bubonic plague and smallpox periodically ravaged Egyptian populations, malaria represented a different kind of threat, a constant, draining presence that shaped daily life along the Nile for millennia. This mosquito-borne disease was so deeply embedded in Egyptian existence that they didn't view it as an extraordinary disaster, but as an expected part of life, particularly during certain seasons. The Nile brought life-giving water and fertile soil. Therefore, Egyptians built their civilization along its banks. The river's annual flood created ideal breeding conditions for mosquitoes. However, abandoning the floodplain wasn't an option for an agricultural society dependent on its bounty. The ancient Egyptians didn't understand that malaria was caused by parasites transmitted through mosquito bites. They couldn't see the microscopic plasmodium organisms invading their red blood cells, multiplying until the cells burst, releasing more parasites to continue the cycle. Instead, they attributed the cyclical fevers, chills, and weakness to supernatural forces or environmental factors like bad air rising from swamps, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong since those swamps were indeed where the mosquitoes bred. It's a bit like blaming your sneezing on dust rather than identifying the specific dust mite allergens. You're in the right neighborhood, just missing the specific address. Egyptian medical texts described what we now recognize as malaria using terms like febris niliatica, nilotic fever, or simply the shivering. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains a passage about fever of the season that appears annually with the flooding. The Ebers Papyrus recommends treatments for periodic fevers, including willow bark, which contains salicylic acid similar to aspirin, that might have actually provided some symptomatic relief. Other recommended remedies included eating raw garlic, drinking beer infused with specific herbs, and wearing protective amulets depicting Sekhmet. I imagine ancient Egyptian mothers sounding remarkably similar to modern ones. Put on your fever amulet before you go out. Do you want to catch your death by the canal? Evidence of malaria's presence in ancient Egypt comes from multiple sources. DNA analysis of mummified tissue has detected Plasmodium falciparum, the most dangerous malaria species, in several royal mummies, including Tutankhamun. CT scans of mummies frequently show an enlarged spleen, a common sign of chronic malaria infection. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains reveal bone abnormalities consistent with anemia caused by long-term malaria exposure. Taken together, these findings confirm that malaria was widespread throughout Egyptian history, affecting people from all social classes. Unlike the rapid devastation of plague or smallpox, malaria's impact was more insidious. The disease existed in both acute and chronic forms. Some victims, particularly those without previous exposure, might develop severe symptoms leading to death within days. This malignant tertian form, caused by Plasmodium falciparum, probably claimed many lives among vulnerable populations like children and pregnant women. A famous New Kingdom papyrus contains a father's lament for his dead child, describing the burning that came with the inundation and took you from me, likely a reference to fatal malaria. More commonly, Egyptians developed a form of partial immunity after repeated infections, resulting in chronic cases with recurring episodes of fever, anemia, and fatigue. This pattern created a population constantly cycling between illness and recovery, with periodic relapses sapping strength and productivity. Imagine trying to build a pyramid while battling fever that returns every few weeks like an unwelcome relative who just can't take a hint. The workforce efficiency implications alone must have been staggering. Ancient Egypt's version of calling in sick, except without the option of working remotely or using accumulated sick days. Malaria shaped Egyptian society in profound ways. Architectural choices reflect adaptation to mosquito threats. Elevated sleeping quarters, high windows, and roof sleeping areas during hot months all reduced exposure to the low-flying Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit the disease. Religious practices incorporated protection against periodic fevers, with specific prayers and offerings made to Sekhmet and Isis during high-risk seasons. Medical specialists developed treatments specifically for the recurring cycles of chills and fever, creating a specialized subset of healing practices. Population distribution followed patterns influenced by malaria risk. Archaeological surveys show that settlements were often situated slightly away from marshlands, balancing the need for water access against the danger of mosquito-borne illness. In the Delta region, villages typically occupied elevated areas less prone to standing water. This geographic adaptation mirrors patterns seen in other malaria-endemic regions throughout history, humans intuitively learning to avoid the most dangerous areas without understanding the actual mechanism of transmission. Military campaigns had to account for malaria's seasonal patterns. Several inscriptions describe Egyptian armies timing their movements to avoid peak malaria seasons in specific regions. A famous account from the reign of Thutmose III mentions delaying an attack on a Canaanite city until after the time of fevers had passed. Foreign mercenaries from non-malarial regions proved especially vulnerable when stationed in Egypt, lacking the partial immunity developed by locals. It's essentially the ancient version of forgetting to get your travel vaccines before your big international trip, except instead of a stern talking to from your doctor, you got a potentially fatal parasitic infection. The disease influenced Egyptian genetics over generations. Certain hereditary blood disorders like sickle cell trait provide partial protection against severe malaria. Although less common in Egypt than in sub-Saharan Africa, these protective genetic adaptations appear in higher frequencies in ancient Egyptian remains from heavily affected areas, particularly the Delta region. This represents natural selection in action. Individuals with protective traits survived at higher rates, passing those traits to their offspring. Human evolution and parasite evolution locked in a deadly dance for thousands of years, neither gaining permanent advantage. The story of one noble family from Thebes during the 18th dynasty illustrates malaria's generational impact. Inscriptions in their family tomb describe 3 generations plagued by the shivering sickness. The grandfather attributes his failure to advance at court to frequent illness that prevented him from completing important assignments. His son managed slightly better, becoming a mid-level official despite carrying the family affliction. The grandson died young, his funeral stele mentioning the fever that returned with each flood and finally took him to Osiris. This family's experience, spanning decades and generations, epitomizes malaria's chronic, persistent drain on human potential. Pregnant women faced particular danger from malaria. The disease increases risks of miscarriage, stillbirth, and maternal death. Analysis of female mummies and skeletal remains shows higher rates of pregnancy complications in remains from areas with likely high malaria transmission. Fertility amulets, specifically mentioning protection against the shivering during pregnancy, have been found in women's tombs, highlighting awareness of this vulnerability. Women's prayers and offerings often focused on Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess who protected mothers and infants against all threats, including disease. Children suffered disproportionately from malaria in ancient Egypt, just as they do in endemic regions today. Without acquired immunity, their first infections often proved severe or fatal. Egyptian cemeteries show periodic spikes in child burials correlating with peak mosquito seasons. Parents sought protection through various magical practices, including protective spells written on papyrus, dissolved in water, and given to children to drink. Perhaps history's least appealing flavor of Kool-Aid, though likely no less effective than many of our own well-intentioned but dubious home remedies. Despite malaria's devastating toll, Egyptians adapted and endured. They developed cultural, architectural, and medical responses that allowed their civilization to flourish despite the constant drain of endemic disease. The patterns they established, seasonal precautions, environmental management, and specialized treatments, prefigured modern public health approaches to malaria control. Their experience reminds us that humans have always lived alongside disease, finding ways to survive and even thrive despite microscopic threats that remain our oldest and most persistent enemies. A young woman dips her clay pot into the Nile. The water looks clear, inviting. She drinks deeply, quenching her thirst under the merciless sun. Invisible to her eyes, bacteria swirl in that water. Salmonella typhi, Shigella, amoebic parasites. She has just invited killers into her body. Within days, she'll be fighting for her life against enemies she cannot see, wielding weapons she cannot understand. Water sustains all life. But for ancient Egyptians, it delivered death as readily as life. The same river that made their civilization possible, therefore became their most intimate health threat. They revered the Nile as a god. However, its waters harbored microscopic dangers their world-class physicians could never detect. This paradox, the life-giver as life-taker, defined the Egyptian relationship with waterborne disease for 3,000 years. While the Nile's annual flood brought fertility to Egyptian fields, it also spread contamination throughout the floodplain. Human waste, animal carcasses, and various pollutants washed into the river and its tributaries. During low water seasons, the problem worsened as reduced flow concentrated contaminants. For a civilization without germ theory or water treatment technology, this created perfect conditions for ongoing cycles of enteric intestinal diseases. Chief among these waterborne threats was typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria. This severe, sometimes fatal illness produces sustained high fevers, abdominal pain, and often a distinctive rash. DNA analysis of ancient Egyptian remains has found evidence of typhoid in multiple sites spanning from the early dynastic to the Ptolemaic periods. A particularly telling discovery came from a communal grave near Thebes dating to around 1500 BCE, where researchers found S. typhi DNA in the dental pulp of multiple skeletons, suggesting these individuals died during a typhoid outbreak. Egyptian medical texts describe what appears to be typhoid, calling it the burning bowel disease, or the fever that consumes from within. The Ebers Papyrus recommends treatments including cool baths, willow bark tea for fever, and various herbal preparations to reduce intestinal inflammation. These remedies couldn't eliminate the bacterial infection, but might have provided symptomatic relief, somewhat like treating a modern systemic infection with nothing but Tylenol and Pepto-Bismol, while hoping your immune system eventually figures things out. Spoiler alert, sometimes it doesn't. Dysentery, caused by Shigella bacteria or amoebic parasites, represented another common waterborne threat. This infection produces severe diarrhea, often bloody, along with painful abdominal cramps, fever, and dehydration. Without effective treatment, dysentery can kill within days through severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. The disease appears frequently in Egyptian medical texts, where it's described with uncomfortable precision as the sickness of bloody stools that empties the body of life. Treatment recommendations for dysentery included astringent preparations made from pomegranate rind, which contains tannins that can reduce intestinal inflammation and slow diarrhea. Other remedies involve concoctions of clay, charcoal, and specific herbs, some of which might have actually helped absorb toxins and reduce fluid loss. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of Imodium, except instead of a convenient caplet, you're drinking what essentially amounts to garden dirt mixed with fruit peels. Side effects not listed on the papyrus, but almost certainly experienced, include tastes terrible and makes you question if the cure is worse than the disease. Archaeological evidence confirms dysentery's prevalence in ancient Egypt. Examinations of mummified intestinal tissue have found Entamoeba histolytica, the parasite causing amoebic dysentery. Skeletal remains sometimes show evidence of dehydration-related damage consistent with fatal dysenteric episodes. Most tellingly, latrine sites from multiple periods contain parasite eggs and bacterial traces in concentrations suggesting widespread infection. Other waterborne diseases that plagued Egyptians included cholera, giardiasis, and various helminth, worm infections. These parasitic worms, particularly schistosomes that cause schistosomiasis, remain endemic to the Nile Valley even today. The infection cycle involves parasites penetrating the skin when people wade or swim in contaminated water. Once inside the body, These worms cause chronic illness, gradually damaging internal organs and sapping strength. Examination of mummies has found calcified schistosome eggs in bladder and intestinal tissues, confirming that this modern Egyptian health problem has ancient roots. So how did ancient Egyptians attempt to protect themselves from waterborne illness without understanding its causes? Some practices accidentally provided partial protection. Wine and beer consumption, central to Egyptian culture, involved water that had been boiled or fermented, killing many pathogens. The wealthy sometimes added herbs or honey to water, unknowingly taking advantage of the antimicrobial properties of these additives. Religious purification rituals that involve specific water handling practices may have reduced contamination in some contexts. The upper classes enjoyed certain advantages in avoiding waterborne disease. Wealthy households employed servants to fetch water from cleaner upstream sources rather than from stagnant pools or downstream areas contaminated by upstream settlements. The elite could afford wine instead of water as their primary beverage. Their homes featured private wells, less likely to be contaminated than public water sources. It's the ancient equivalent of today's bottled water versus tap water debate, except the stakes were life or death, rather than whether you can taste the difference in your coffee. For the average Egyptian, water-related health risks were simply facts of life. Laborers working in irrigation canals spent hours daily in contaminated water. Farmers had little choice but to use whatever water sources were available for drinking and cooking. Women doing laundry in the river exposed themselves to waterborne parasites. Children playing in shallow pools during the flood season absorbed pathogens through every splash and sip. The inevitable intestinal illnesses that followed were considered normal, expected, almost as predictable as the Nile's annual rise and fall itself. The social impact of waterborne disease extended beyond individual suffering. During epidemics, labor shortages affected everything from agriculture to monument construction. Tax records occasionally mention reduced collections due to the great sickness of the bowels, affecting entire districts. Religious texts include specific prayers against intestinal ailments, suggesting their cultural significance. Some historians believe that Egypt's emphasis on beer production, far beyond its recreational value, reflected partial recognition that fermented beverages caused fewer digestive problems than plain water. Ancient Egyptian work crews received beer rations not just as payment, but as a public health measure, though the workers probably didn't complain about this particular safety protocol. Mandatory beer consumption for your health surely ranks among history's most enthusiastically followed medical advice. Waterborne illness created particularly severe problems during drought years, when low water levels concentrated contaminants. The famous 7-year famine Stella, from the reign of Djoser, describes not just food shortages, but accompanying disease that emptied villages and filled tombs. This likely represented a deadly combination of malnutrition and water contamination, as desperate people consumed increasingly marginal water sources. Similarly, during unusually high floods, water quality often deteriorated as the river overran waste disposal areas and animal pens, creating what epidemiologists might call a fecal soup situation, though I doubt that precise term appears in any hieroglyphic inscriptions. Medical responses to enteric disease evolved over time. Early texts focus on supernatural causes and magical treatments. Later documents show increasing emphasis on practical interventions like dietary restrictions during intestinal illness, hydration practices, and specific herbal remedies with actual medicinal properties. By the late period, 664 to 332 BCE, Egyptian physicians had developed relatively sophisticated protocols for managing dehydration, including honey-based oral rehydration solutions conceptually similar to modern ORS treatments. They couldn't eliminate the bacterial causes, but they'd learned to counter the most dangerous symptom, fluid loss. The recurring pattern of waterborne disease created a population perpetually cycling through intestinal infections. Childhood exposure generated partial immunity to local pathogen strains, but new variants or particularly virulent outbreaks could still cause widespread illness. Foreign visitors and traders lacked this acquired resistance, making them especially vulnerable. Ancient Egypt's version of traveler's diarrhea could be a death sentence rather than just an unpleasant vacation memory. Egyptian medical texts actually include special treatments for the sickness that afflicts foreigners, suggesting recognition of this differential susceptibility. The Egyptian relationship with water-related illness echoes through their art, literature, and religious practices. Their understanding of these diseases, limited by the invisible nature of microorganisms, relied on observable patterns and effects. Yet despite the immense suffering caused by contaminated water, they never abandoned the Nile. Their civilization remained utterly dependent on the same source that sickened them, a profound reminder that human existence has always balanced precariously between the life-giving and death-dealing aspects of our environment, a tension we navigate even today with our advanced technology and scientific understanding. The granaries stand empty. A mother scrapes the bottom of a clay pot, searching for the last grains of barley. Her children's eyes follow her movements, hollow with hunger. Outside, the Nile has failed to rise, leaving fields cracked and barren. This isn't just hunger. It's a portal through which disease will soon march, claiming those weakened by starvation. In ancient Egypt, famine and plague were dance partners, taking turns leading the grim waltz of death. When we discuss ancient Egyptian plagues, we often focus on specific pathogens, the bacteria, viruses, and parasites that infected human hosts. But these microorganisms didn't operate in isolation. Their success depended largely on the vulnerability of the populations they invaded. Healthy, well-nourished Egyptians stood a fighting chance against infection. Therefore, food security represented the first line of defense against epidemic disease. When the Nile's annual flood failed or fell short, however, the resulting famine created ideal conditions for plagues to flourish, turning manageable diseases into catastrophic outbreaks. Egypt's entire agricultural system hinged on the Nile's annual inundation, which typically began in June and receded by October, leaving behind nutrient-rich silt perfect for growing crops. This predictable cycle created remarkable stability most years, allowing Egypt to become the ancient world's breadbasket. The mainstream historical fact is that this agricultural surplus enabled the development of specialized labor, monumental architecture, and complex administration that defined Egyptian civilization. When the floods came as expected, Egypt thrived. When they didn't, disaster followed. Records carved into the famous Hunger Stone at Sehel Island near Aswan document a 7-year famine during the reign of King Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, around 2650 BCE. The inscription describes how the Nile failed to come in flood for 7 years, and children wept, young people collapsed, the hearts of the old were grieving, their legs drawn up to their bodies, huddling on the ground. While some scholars question whether this specific 7-year famine actually occurred, the inscription was created nearly 2,000 years after the purported event. Archaeological evidence confirms that periodic famines did strike ancient Egypt, sometimes with devastating consequences. The immediate effects of failed floods were obvious. Crops withered, food stores depleted, and hunger spread. But the secondary impacts on disease resistance created even more insidious threats. Malnutrition compromises immune function in multiple ways, making starving bodies fertile ground for pathogens. Protein deficiency impairs antibody production. Vitamin shortages weaken physical barriers like skin and mucous membranes. Mineral deficiencies reduce white blood cell function. It's like trying to defend a castle after you've furloughed the guards, drained the moat, and left the gate unlocked. Technically, you still have a castle, but don't be surprised when invaders make themselves at home. Historians still argue whether the worst famines in Egyptian history were purely natural disasters or partially self-inflicted through policies like grain exportation during shortages, inequitable food distribution, or agricultural mismanagement. Some inscriptions suggest that even during severe shortages, the elite continued to feast while commoners starved. An ancient version of "let them eat cake," except not even cake was available. just the vague suggestion to perhaps try licking the inside of empty grain sacks for sustenance. During periods of food scarcity, Egyptians turned to increasingly desperate dietary alternatives. Archaeobotanical evidence from settlement sites shows consumption of normally avoided plants during famine periods. Coarse grasses, certain reeds, and even plant roots typically considered unpalatable or marginally toxic. Examination of skeletal remains from periods associated with famine shows telltale signs of nutritional stress. Interrupted growth lines in children's bones, evidence of scurvy and rickets, and dental enamel hyperplasia, disrupted tooth development. These physical markers tell silent stories of hunger more eloquent than any written record. One quirky tidbit about Egyptian famine response comes from a New Kingdom papyrus containing a list of acceptable famine foods, which included lotus roots, papyrus pith, and something mysteriously translated as hippopotamus ear bread. What exactly this last item was remains debated. Perhaps a plant named for its resemblance to hippo ears, or possibly actual hippo cartilage processed into an emergency food source. Either way, it certainly didn't make anyone's top 10 tastiest Egyptian dishes list, landing somewhere between desperation and at least I'm not eating mud on the culinary satisfaction scale. Temple inscriptions from the reign of Amenemhat III describe efforts to mitigate famine through grain storage programs. This pharaoh reportedly built massive granary complexes and instituted a system requiring surplus grain collection during abundant years for distribution during shortages, essentially inventing the concept of food security millennia before it became a UN development goal. These measures helped buffer against minor shortfalls, but couldn't prevent catastrophe when multiple consecutive flood failures occurred. Even the most carefully managed emergency reserves eventually ran out, leaving Egyptians to face the dual threats of starvation and disease. The connection between malnutrition and specific diseases appears repeatedly in Egyptian medical texts. The Edwin Smith Papyrus notes that wounds heal poorly in those whose bodies have withered from hunger, while the Ebers Papyrus identifies wasting of the flesh as a factor predisposing people to various infections. Without understanding the immunological mechanisms involved, Egyptian physicians nonetheless recognized the pattern. Hungry people got sick more often and recovered less frequently than well-fed ones. Famine-related disease outbreaks followed predictable patterns. First came increased intestinal infections as people resorted to contaminated water sources or spoiled food. Next, crowding in areas with remaining food resources facilitated spread of respiratory infections and lice-borne diseases. Finally, as malnutrition weakened entire communities, opportunistic infections that normally caused only mild illness became deadly. A temple inscription from the First Intermediate Period describes how a cough became a journey to the afterlife during a severe famine, a poignant description of how normally survivable respiratory infections turned fatal in malnourished populations. Social breakdown during famines created additional disease risks. Historical records describe desperate migration to areas with remaining food supplies, abandonment of sanitation practices, and even rare instances of cannibalism during the most severe shortages. A controversial inscription from a tomb near Edfu alludes to people consuming what should not be consumed during a catastrophic famine around 2200 BCE. Historians still debate whether this refers to cannibalism, consumption of ritually impure animals, or eating seed grain needed for the next planting, any of which would indicate. Incense smoke fills the temple. Priests in white linen chant desperately, their voices rising above the wails of mourners outside. A golden statue of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of both healing and pestilence, stands bathed in flickering light. Blood from sacrificed animals stains the altar. In the streets, masked figures carry the dead. Doors marked with protective symbols remain sealed, those inside hoping invisible forces will pass them by. Ancient Egypt faces plague the only way it knows how, through ritual, religion, and retreat. When disease struck Egyptian communities, the response was never purely medical. Religious interpretations dominated their understanding of epidemics, but practical measures often accompanied spiritual ones. Egyptians viewed plagues as divine punishment. Therefore, appeasing angry gods became the primary response strategy. Physical isolation of the sick sometimes occurred alongside ritual purification. However, these practical measures remained embedded within religious frameworks rather than representing scientific understanding of contagion. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian temples served as centers for both medical treatment and religious responses to epidemics. Temples dedicated to Sekhmet, the fearsome goddess who could both send and avert plagues, contained special chambers where priest-physicians treated the sick while performing appropriate rituals. Archaeological evidence from these healing temples includes surgical instruments alongside ritual objects, demonstrating how thoroughly the physical and spiritual aspects of medicine were integrated. Inscriptions detail how during major outbreaks, temple activities intensified, with round-the-clock offerings and special prayers performed to appease the divine forces believed responsible for the disease. When plague struck, Egyptians believed the cosmic order, Ma'at, had been disturbed, requiring restoration through ritual action. Surviving temple records describe elaborate ceremonies involving purification, sacrifice, and specific incantations believed to combat disease. One particularly dramatic ritual involved placing clay figurines representing the sick person in small boats and setting them adrift on the Nile, symbolically sending the illness away. It's essentially the ancient equivalent of putting your symptoms in rice, though considerably less effective for your waterlogged smartphone than for your plague-stricken relative, which is to say, not effective at all for either. A quirky tidbit about Egyptian plague response appears in a New Kingdom papyrus, describing a peculiar ritual performed during a spotted disease outbreak, likely smallpox. The text instructs participants to capture live mice, paint red spots on them, then release them into the homes of neighboring settlements. Some scholars interpret this as a primitive attempt at what we might call exposure therapy, deliberately introducing a milder form of disease to build immunity. Others suggest it represented a magical transference of illness to the mice, which would then carry it away. Either way, I'm fairly certain this would violate several modern public health protocols, not to mention animal rights guidelines. The CDC's "Don't release painted disease mice into your neighbor's house" policy is quite strict these days. Physical isolation of the sick represented one of the more practical Egyptian responses to epidemic disease. Texts mention special structures called houses of separation, where those with visible infectious conditions were kept apart from the general population. These facilities, often located at settlement edges, combined medical care with ritual purification. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village housing workers who built the royal tombs, uncovered what appears to be such an isolation facility dating to around 1250 BCE. The building contains evidence of medical treatments alongside ritual objects associated with purification ceremonies. Historians still argue whether these isolation practices stemmed from empirical observation of disease transmission or simply from religious concepts of ritual purity and contamination. The distinction matters for understanding how much practical epidemiological knowledge ancient Egyptians possessed versus how much their effective practices emerged accidentally from religious beliefs. Some scholars point to specific instructions in medical texts about avoiding contact with impure individuals as evidence of genuine contagion understanding. Others maintain that the concept of impurity remained primarily spiritual rather than medical, with physical separation serving ritual rather than epidemiological purposes. During severe outbreaks, entire communities sometimes practiced forms of quarantine. Inscriptions describe villages barring entry to outsiders during epidemics, with guards posted at access points to prevent potentially infected travelers from entering. This practice appears most commonly in records from frontier regions and trade hubs, where disease often arrived via foreign contact. One 18th dynasty account describes how a border town closed itself like a box during a sickness from Asia, with inhabitants refusing to admit even Egyptian officials until the danger had passed. It's the ancient version of changing your relationship status to "it's complicated" with the rest of civilization. Except instead of ignoring texts from your ex, you're ignoring the pharaoh's tax collectors, which admittedly carries slightly higher stakes. Religious amulets played a crucial role in personal protection during epidemics. Archaeologists have discovered numerous examples of specialized plague amulets, typically depicting protective deities like Sekhmet, Bes, or Tauret. These were worn around the neck or wrist, often inscribed with spells specifically mentioning protection against the striking sickness or spotted disease. Analysis of burial sites from known epidemic periods shows increased presence of these protective objects, suggesting heightened demand during outbreaks. Think of them as the ancient Egyptian version of panic-buying hand sanitizer and face masks, except with considerably more artistic merit and slightly less scientific backing. Fumigation represented another common plague response with both ritual and practical dimensions. Texts describe burning specific woods, resins, and herbs to purify the air during outbreaks. Interestingly, some of these substances, particularly cedar oil, myrrh, and certain aromatic herbs, do possess antimicrobial properties that might have provided limited benefit. One text recommends fumigating homes with burning cypress and juniper daily during a time of pestilence, noting that the smoke drives away the invisible arrows of Sekhmet. While the Egyptians attributed the effect to supernatural forces, they had accidentally stumbled upon a marginally effective disinfection method. It's rather like discovering that your grandmother's bizarre home remedy actually contains a compound pharmaceutical companies would later synthesize. She was right all along, just for entirely different reasons than she thought. Purification rituals for survivors of plague reveal the psychological impact of epidemic disease. Those who recovered underwent ceremonial cleansing before rejoining society, including bathing in herb-infused water, wearing new clothing, and participating in temple ceremonies. These practices served important social and psychological functions, providing a structured transition from illness back to health and community reintegration. The emphasis on purification also reinforced the conceptual link between disease and impurity, whether physical or spiritual. Changes in burial practices during epidemics reflected both practical necessity and altered religious concepts. When death rates overwhelmed normal funerary resources, Egyptians modified their elaborate burial traditions. Mass graves appeared during major outbreaks, with bodies sometimes receiving only minimal preparation rather than full mummification. However, archaeological evidence shows that even in these emergency burials, attempts were made to include at least token funerary objects and perform abbreviated rituals. The Egyptian commitment to proper funeral practices ran so deep that even during catastrophic epidemics, they refused to abandon these traditions entirely. They just created the express checkout version. The psychological impact of believing illness represented divine punishment cannot be overstated. For Egyptians, epidemics weren't random biological events, but meaningful communications from the gods. This framework provided explanations for otherwise incomprehensible suffering, while offering pathways to response through ritual action. When medicines failed, prayers could continue. When doctors had no more treatments to offer, priests still had ceremonies to perform. This integration of the medical and spiritual created a comprehensive response system, addressing both physical symptoms and existential questions raised by epidemic disease. Despite their supernatural explanations, Egyptian responses to plague sometimes demonstrated remarkable pragmatism. Temple records show that priests tracked seasonal disease patterns, identifying high-risk periods when preventative rituals should be intensified. Quarantine measures, while religiously framed, effectively reduced transmission. Certain medical treatments provided genuine symptom relief, even if accompanied by magical incantations. This mixture of practical observation and religious interpretation created a system that was neither purely superstitious nor truly scientific, a hybrid approach that offered both psychological comfort and occasional practical benefit. The Egyptian response to epidemics reveals a society grappling with forces beyond its understanding, yet refusing to surrender to helplessness. Through ritual, religion, and isolation, they created meaning from suffering and established patterns of response that provided structure amid chaos. Their integrated approach reminds us that throughout human history, our reactions to disease have never been purely medical or purely spiritual, but complex combinations reflecting our dual nature as both biological organisms and meaning-seeking beings. A duality we still navigate today as we face our own modern plagues with a mixture of science, spirituality, and the human need to find purpose in our pain. A woman dips linen into cool water. With gentle hands, she presses the cloth to a feverish brow. Nearby, herbs simmer in a clay pot, filling the room with pungent aroma. The patient moans, delirious with plague. The caregiver whispers prayers while administering medicine. She knows the risks. Many in her position have fallen ill themselves. Yet she continues, embodying an ancient tradition of compassionate care that transcends time. This is Egyptian nursing, thousands of years before Florence Nightingale. While physician priests performed diagnoses and prescribed treatments in ancient Egypt, the actual hands-on care of the sick fell primarily to others. Women dominated this proto-nursing profession, but their crucial role has been largely overshadowed in historical records by male physician priests. These caregivers lacked formal medical titles. Therefore, their contributions remained mostly anonymous. The dangers they faced were immense. However, without their practical skills and compassionate care, even the most brilliant medical knowledge of the age would have been merely theoretical. The mainstream historical fact is that Egyptian medical care operated through a clearly defined hierarchy. At the top stood specialized physician priests with titles like Greatest of Physicians or Eye of Horus Doctor, who diagnosed illness and prescribed treatments. Below them worked the practical healers who implemented these prescriptions, preparing medicines, changing dressings, monitoring symptoms, and providing basic comfort measures. These caregivers, many of whom were women, represented the ancient equivalent of nurses, though their training was primarily through apprenticeship rather than formal education. Archaeological evidence from healing centers attached to temples shows dedicated spaces where patients received ongoing care during recovery. Remains of beds, feeding utensils, and hygiene equipment suggest extended stays with attentive treatment. Inscriptions occasionally mention individuals with titles like Keeper of the Sick or Tender of the Afflicted, indicating some degree of specialization and recognition for caregiving roles. During epidemics, these caregivers worked at extraordinary risk to themselves, as evidenced by the higher-than-average presence of disease markers in skeletal remains from cemetery sections dedicated to temple personnel. A quirky tidbit about Egyptian nursing practices comes from a satirical text known as the Instruction of Ankh-Sheshonq, which advises, "Do not let a woman who has nursed you through illness become your wife, for she will remind you of your weakness every day." Apparently, the dynamic of someone having seen you at your most vulnerable and disgusting moment was considered just as awkward in ancient Egypt as it is today. It's the 3,000-year-old equivalent of dating your nurse after they've helped you through an embarrassing medical procedure. A scenario modern hospital ethics committees and romantic comedies alike have strong but differing opinions about. Egyptian caregivers developed surprisingly effective palliative techniques. Pain management utilized opium poppy derivatives, mandrake, and cannabis preparations. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes special positioning methods for patients with respiratory distress, including what modern medicine would recognize as recovery position. Fever reduction employed cool baths and alcohol sponging. These techniques demonstrate remarkable empirical observation despite limited theoretical understanding. They couldn't explain why something worked, but they certainly noticed when it did, rather like how most of us use smartphones without comprehending the first thing about semiconductor physics. Historians still argue whether these caregiving roles provided Egyptian women with rare professional opportunities or merely extended their domestic duties into a more public sphere. Some scholars view these healing roles as empowering paths that gave women authority and respect outside the home. Others interpret them as exploitative extensions of women's presumed natural nurturing abilities, pressed into service without the status or recognition afforded to male physician priests. The debate essentially centers on whether ancient Egyptian female caregivers would have viewed themselves as professionals with valued expertise or as performing an expected gender role with little choice in the matter. Family members provided most routine care for ill relatives, following the physician's instructions with varying degrees of accuracy, not unlike today's "I'm sure I took all my antibiotics, doctor" phenomenon that somehow always leaves 3 pills forgotten in the bottle. However, during epidemics when multiple household members fell ill simultaneously, or when diseases required specialized treatment, professional caregivers became essential. Temple records mention houses of life that provided care for those without family support or with particularly serious conditions. Among the most dangerous caregiving assignments was tending to those with highly contagious diseases like smallpox. Certain temples maintained isolation facilities where specialized attendants provided care while following purification rituals believed to offer protection. These caregivers often lived separately from their families during outbreaks, similar to how modern healthcare workers sometimes isolated from vulnerable family members during the COVID-19 pandemic. Except instead of FaceTime calls to stay connected, ancient Egyptian caregivers had to settle for messages delivered by possibly plague-contaminated servants. Communication technology has definitely improved in at least this one respect. The psychological aspects of caregiving received surprising attention in Egyptian medical practice. The Ebers Papyrus recommends speaking words of power and encouragement as part of treatment, recognizing the therapeutic value of positive communication. Other texts advise caregivers to tell patients stories to distract them from pain and to provide music for those with darkness in the spirit, possibly depression. One particularly compassionate instruction tells caregivers to be gentle in touch and voice when treating the elderly or severely ill, as the journey to the next world is made easier by kindness in this one. This holistic approach integrated physical care with emotional support in ways that would not seem out of place in modern nursing philosophy. Women's traditional knowledge of herbalism and practical healing formed the foundation of many Egyptian medical treatments. While male physician priests recorded and systematized this knowledge in medical papyri, much of it originated from female healers' empirical observations passed down through generations. Herbal remedies for common ailments, willow bark for pain, garlic for respiratory infections, honey for wound dressing, likely originated in women's domestic healing practices before being incorporated into official medical texts. It's a historical pattern seen across cultures. Men often got credit for systematizing and documenting knowledge that women had developed through practical experience, the ancient equivalent of a man repeating a woman's idea in a meeting and getting praised for it. The spiritual dimension of caregiving held particular importance during epidemic disease when physical treatments often proved ineffective. Caregivers recited prayers and incantations while administering medications, creating a therapeutic environment addressing both physical and psychological needs. They helped patients fulfill religious obligations despite illness and facilitated proper preparation for death when recovery seemed unlikely. This integration of spiritual and physical care recognized the human need for meaning during suffering, something modern healthcare sometimes struggles to provide despite our advanced technologies. Physical techniques employed by Egyptian caregivers included therapeutic massage, heat application through heated stones, and hydrotherapy in sacred pools. These approaches often combined practical benefit with religious significance. For instance, massage techniques followed pathways believed to correspond with the body's mystical channels, while hydrotherapy utilized water from sacred sources thought to possess healing properties. The effectiveness of these methods likely varied widely, but the combination of physical touch, ritualized care, and focused attention probably provided genuine comfort and possibly improved outcomes through what we would now recognize as psychosomatic effects. During major epidemics, the normal caregiving systems could become overwhelmed. Temple records describe emergency measures implemented during such crises, including training additional caregivers, establishing temporary treatment centers, and modifying normal therapeutic practices to accommodate larger numbers of patients. A New Kingdom account describes how during a great pestilence, temple authorities recruited and gave basic training to women from surrounding villages to assist overwhelmed regular caregivers. These emergency responders received rapid instruction in basic treatments, purification rituals, and preparation of common remedies, ancient Egypt's version of a crash course for healthcare workers during a crisis. The risks faced by caregivers during epidemics were well understood, though explained through religious rather than contagion frameworks. Texts mention protective amulets specifically designed for those treating contagious diseases. Special purification rituals for caregivers included frequent bathing, clothing changes, and fumigation with specific incenses believed to provide protection. Some of these practices, particularly the emphasis on cleanliness, may have offered limited actual protection, though their primary purpose remained spiritual rather than hygienic by modern standards. The legacy of these ancient caregivers lives on in the fundamental human impulse to tend to the sick with compassion and practical assistance. Their efforts represented a profound expression of humanity's better nature, the willingness to risk one's own health to alleviate another's suffering. While their understanding of disease mechanisms would seem primitive by modern standards, their commitment to easing suffering through both practical care and compassionate presence embodies values that remain at the heart of healthcare even today. Through plagues both ancient and modern, it is not only medical knowledge that heals us, but the human hands that deliver that care with gentleness and dignity. A pharaoh's tomb stands sealed for eternity. Inside, wall paintings show the deceased ruler smiting enemies and dining with gods. Conspicuously absent, any mention of the plague that likely killed him. History written by the survivors rarely dwells on defeats, even those inflicted by microscopic enemies. Yet these invisible invaders shaped Egyptian civilization as profoundly as any foreign army or natural disaster, leaving legacies that continue to influence our world thousands of years later. The plagues that repeatedly struck ancient Egypt left marks far deeper than the pockmarks on royal mummies. Disease shaped Egyptian history on every level, from grand political transitions to intimate religious beliefs. But the pharaonic propaganda machine rarely acknowledged these biological defeats. Official inscriptions praised rulers for defeating human enemies. Therefore, epidemic disasters disappeared from official records. Disease killed thousands without discrimination. However, the resulting societal transformations created lasting cultural adaptations that sometimes strengthened the civilization's resilience. The mainstream historical fact is that several major dynastic transitions in ancient Egyptian history coincided with epidemic disease events. Archaeological evidence suggests that the collapse of the Old Kingdom around 2180 BCE occurred during a period of severe climate change that triggered famine and disease outbreaks. Similarly, the end of the Middle Kingdom corresponds with evidence of increased disease burden. While multiple factors contributed to these political transformations, epidemic disease played a significant role by disrupting administration, reducing tax revenue, and sometimes killing rulers or heirs directly. It's rather like how COVID-19 influenced modern elections and governance, except without the added complications of Twitter misinformation campaigns or Zoom parliamentary sessions where someone can't figure out how to unmute. Egyptian medical knowledge, developed in response to frequent disease challenges, became one of the civilization's most influential exports. The medical papyri containing diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments circulated throughout the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Greek physicians studied in Egypt and incorporated Egyptian techniques into their own medical traditions. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, drew heavily from Egyptian predecessors. This Egyptian medical influence eventually filtered into medieval European and Islamic medicine, establishing diagnostic approaches and treatment categories that persisted for millennia. Some Egyptian pharmacological discoveries, like using willow bark, containing salicylic acid, similar to aspirin, for pain, remain relevant in modern medicine, though thankfully without the accompanying incantations to Sekhmet. Religious practices evolved significantly in response to epidemic disease. Early in Egyptian history, disease was associated primarily with specific deities who could send or avert plagues. But by the New Kingdom period, more complex theological interpretations emerged, linking disease to moral and ethical transgressions rather than simply divine caprice. This shift toward connecting illness with personal and societal behavior represents an important step in the development of ethical religion. The concept that societies might bring disease upon themselves through immoral actions later influenced Judeo-Christian and Islamic thought, eventually evolving into modern public health ethics that still sometimes frame disease in moral terms, though we're more likely to blame poor sanitation policy than insufficient offerings to lion-headed goddesses. A quirky tidbit about Egyptian plague responses appears in a late-period temple inscription describing the festival of intoxication dedicated to Sekhmet. During this annual celebration designed to pacify the goddess and prevent her from sending plagues, participants would deliberately drink to the point of unconsciousness. Priestesses of Sekhmet prepared special red beer believed to symbolize blood, and temple attendees were encouraged to drink until they passed out, representing humanity's submission to the goddess's power. It's essentially the ancient equivalent of a college freshman explaining to campus police that their excessive drinking was actually a deeply religious experience intended to ward off disease. The excuse probably worked about as well then as it would now, though the official sanction of temple authorities certainly helped. Archaeological evidence reveals how disease influenced Egyptian architecture and urban planning. After major epidemics, settlement patterns often changed, with new construction incorporating features that, though explained through religious frameworks, had practical health benefits. Wider streets improved air circulation. Designated areas for waste disposal appeared at settlement edges. Some homes featured specialized sick rooms with separate ventilation. These adaptations, while conceived as responses to spiritual contamination rather than germ theory, nevertheless created healthier living environments. It's one of history's happy accidents, like discovering penicillin from a contaminated petri dish, except on an architectural scale spanning centuries. Historians still argue whether the famous Plague Prayers of Mursili describe an epidemic that originated in Egypt before spreading to the Hittite Empire. These Hittite texts from around 1322 BCE describe a devastating epidemic lasting 20 years, which Mursili attributes to his kingdom's violation of a treaty with Egypt. The disease allegedly began after Hittite forces captured Egyptian prisoners who carried a plague of death into Hatti. Some scholars view this as evidence of Egypt exporting an epidemic, possibly smallpox, that significantly altered the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Others interpret it as merely a convenient excuse for the Hittite king to blame his troubles on foreign contamination, rather than domestic policy failures, a political strategy for disease management that should sound depressingly familiar to modern ears. The social memory of epidemics influenced Egyptian literature and wisdom teachings. Surviving texts include proverbs and instructions specifically addressing behavior during disease outbreaks. The instruction of Amenemope advises readers to show compassion toward those affected by the striking sickness, while other wisdom texts emphasize the importance of maintaining ritual purity to avoid divine punishment through disease. These literary responses represent attempts to extract meaning from suffering and establish ethical frameworks for responding to epidemics, precursors to works like Camus' The Plague or Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, though with considerably more references to crocodile deities. Modern scientific research on ancient Egyptian remains continues to yield valuable insights for contemporary medicine. Genetic analysis of pathogens preserved in mummified tissue helps track the evolutionary history of diseases that still affect humans today. Studies of ancient Egyptian treatments have occasionally inspired modern pharmaceutical research. The antimicrobial properties of some traditional remedies have been confirmed by laboratory testing. Even their palliative care approaches, particularly pain management techniques using opium derivatives, influenced the development of modern pain relief methods. It's a remarkable example of ancient wisdom contributing to contemporary science, though I suspect Egyptian physician priests would be rather confused by double-blind clinical trials and statistical significance calculations. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Egyptian plagues lies in how they demonstrate the fundamental continuity of human experience across millennia. Reading accounts of how Egyptians faced epidemic disease reveals emotional and social responses strikingly similar to those observed during modern outbreaks. The initial denial, the search for scapegoats, the desperate remedies, the religious interpretations, the eventual adaptations. All these patterns recur throughout history whenever societies face invisible killers. The specific explanatory frameworks may change from angry deities to viral mutations, but the basic human reactions remain remarkably consistent. This continuity reminds us that while medical science has advanced tremendously, giving us tools the Egyptians could never have imagined, the essential human experience of confronting mortality through disease outbreaks remains a constant across civilizations. When we don masks during modern pandemics, we echo ancient Egyptian protective rituals. When we seek meaning in suffering, we ask the same questions posed by plague victims along the Nile 5,000 years ago. Their struggles against invisible enemies were not so different from our own. Separated by time and technology, but united by our shared humanity in the face of microscopic threats that have shaped our societies since the first cities rose from the desert sands. The sun sets over modern Cairo. Skyscrapers cast long shadows over the Nile, the same river that witnessed thousands of years of triumph and tragedy. In a museum nearby, a mummified pharaoh sleeps in climate-controlled silence, his body still bearing the scars of the smallpox that likely killed him. The ancient and modern worlds touch across millennia, connected by our shared vulnerability to microscopic invaders that have shaped human history from the beginning. As we conclude our journey through ancient Egypt's brutal encounters with epidemic disease, I'm struck by how familiar their struggles feel, despite the vast differences in medical knowledge and technology. They faced invisible enemies with the tools available to them, but lacked our understanding of bacteria, viruses, and contagion. They developed sophisticated responses to disease. Therefore, many of their practices accidentally aligned with modern public health principles. They suffered devastating losses. However, they continuously adapted, creating medical and cultural innovations that influenced civilizations for millennia afterward. The mainstream historical fact is that despite recurring epidemic disasters, ancient Egyptian civilization displayed remarkable resilience, persisting for over 3,000 years through countless disease outbreaks. This longevity, unmatched by most other ancient civilizations, speaks to the effectiveness of their adaptive strategies. Their pragmatic responses to disease, though wrapped in religious frameworks, often incorporated genuinely useful practices like isolation of the sick, attention to water quality, and sophisticated wound care. The combination of practical observation and religious interpretation created a comprehensive approach that addressed both physical symptoms and psychological needs during health crises. Walking in the footsteps of these ancient plague survivors offers us a humbling perspective on our own modern epidemics. When COVID-19 swept across the globe in 2020, many of us experienced what felt like unprecedented disruption and fear. But for the people we've discussed throughout this series, epidemic disease wasn't an extraordinary event, but a recurring feature of ordinary life. They didn't have the luxury of tracking case numbers on smartphones or developing mRNA vaccines in laboratories. Their refrigerators weren't stocked with food delivery options for lockdown periods. There was no unemployment insurance for laborers when plague shut down construction projects. And yet, they endured, not just as a civilization, but as individuals who found meaning and moments of joy even amid recurring biological disasters. A quirky tidbit about Egyptian attitudes toward disease appears in a little-studied tomb inscription from the late period, where an official named Horemheb boasts not of conquests or wealth, but of surviving 3 major plague outbreaks. The text proudly declares him thrice tested by Sekhmet and found worthy, suggesting that plague survival became a point of pride and perhaps even a qualification for leadership. It's the ancient equivalent of listing thrived during pandemic on your LinkedIn profile, though considerably more impressive given the lack of remote work options and DoorDash delivery in 2500 BCE. What lessons might we draw from ancient Egypt's millennia of experience with epidemic disease? Perhaps the most obvious is the recognition that societies can adapt and flourish despite recurring biological threats. The Egyptians never eliminated smallpox or malaria. That technological capability lay thousands of years in their future, but they developed systems to function despite these challenges. They created medical treatments that, while imperfect, offered genuine benefits. They established cultural practices that provided psychological resilience during health crises. They maintained continuity of knowledge through careful documentation of medical observations. In short, they refused to surrender to invisible enemies they couldn't even properly identify. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian medical knowledge represents primarily a scientific achievement or a religious one. Some scholars emphasize the empirical observations and practical treatments documented in medical papyri, viewing Egyptian medicine as a proto-scientific tradition that laid groundwork for later medical developments. Others focus on the religious frameworks and magical elements that permeated Egyptian healing practices, seeing the practical elements as almost accidental byproducts of spiritually motivated behaviors. This debate reflects our modern tendency to separate science and religion into distinct categories, a division the Egyptians themselves would have found incomprehensible, as their approach integrated observation, practice, and spiritual belief into a seamless whole. The Egyptian experience with plague offers uncomfortable parallels to modern pandemic responses. Their tendency to sometimes blame outsiders or marginalized groups for introducing disease echoes troublingly in recent xenophobic reactions to COVID-19. The disparities in how disease affected different social classes, with the wealthy enjoying better protection and treatment options, remains painfully familiar. Even the tension between religious interpretations and practical health measures resurfaces in contemporary debates. It seems some aspects of human nature remain stubbornly consistent across 5,000 years of supposed progress. I'm not saying we're exactly like the ancient Egyptians, but if they had Twitter, I suspect the hashtags during plague outbreaks would be depressingly similar to our own. Despite these sobering continuities, there's something oddly comforting about placing our modern plague experiences within this longer historical context. When we don masks, or practice social distancing during contemporary outbreaks, we join a human tradition stretching back to those ancient caregivers who instinctively covered their faces with linen when treating the infected. When we seek meaning in suffering or yearn for normalcy amid disruption, we're asking the same questions posed by plague victims along the Nile thousands of years ago. The specific answers may differ, but the questions remain constant, as does the fundamental human determination to survive, adapt, and find meaning despite biological threats. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of ancient Egyptian plague response was their refusal to surrender hope. Despite recurring epidemics that sometimes killed significant percentages of the population, they continued building for the future, constructing monuments meant to last eternities, developing agricultural systems to sustain generations yet unborn, and documenting medical knowledge for future practitioners. They understood something we sometimes forget in our technology-focused approach to disease, that human resilience depends not just on medical interventions, but on maintaining the cultural, spiritual, and social frameworks that give life meaning beyond mere survival. As modern science continues unraveling the mysteries of ancient Egyptian disease through paleopathology, genetic analysis, and archaeological investigation, we gain not just historical knowledge, but potential insights relevant to contemporary health challenges. Understanding how diseases have evolved over millennia helps predict future adaptations. Studying ancient treatment approaches occasionally reveals forgotten remedies worth re-examining with modern methods. Analyzing how societies adapted to recurring epidemics provides models for community resilience strategies. The ancient Egyptians would likely be astonished by our microscopes, vaccines, and antibiotics. They would marvel at our ability to sequence the genomes of ancient pathogens preserved in mummified tissue. But they might also recognize something familiar in our fundamental human reactions to epidemic threat: the fear, the adaptation, the meaning-making, and ultimately the determination to continue building civilization despite invisible enemies. For all our technological advancement, we remain biological creatures, vulnerable to microscopic threats, connected across time to those ancient plague survivors by our shared humanity and the timeless struggle to create meaning and beauty in a world where death can arrive on something as small as a mosquito's wing or as invisible as a contaminated breath.